So I'm really delighted to chair our next panel, People and Projects. And I think many of the themes of the papers connect so well with what we were thinking about yesterday, and particularly some of the themes and ideas raised by the session this morning. I think one of the main themes for reflection in this panel is thinking about how we capture, record, archive, write and communicate the histories of architecture. And a lot of the papers in this panel will take a case study approach. And I think through those case studies, our speakers will be thinking about the politics and strategies of reassessment and recovery, reappraisal, and looking again at the careers and lives of individuals, but thinking about how those careers were practiced in a wider landscape in which places shape people, and people, of course, shape places. So what we're going to do, we have 4 presentations, and to keep the focus and the energy, we're going to have 2 presentations and then take some questions, 2 more presentations and then take some questions, and then hopefully at the end there'll be time to gather everyone together and have a round table and hopefully unpick some of the broader themes of the panel. I'm just going to introduce our speakers very briefly because all their biographies are in the pack, so you can read about their very impressive careers at length. And so our first speaker will be Paul Makovsky, who's an editor, a writer, a curator, and the vice president of design at Metropolis magazine, a New York-based publication, so somebody very aware of thinking about how histories are communicated. And then our next presentation will be by Fiona McLachlan and Ewen McLachlan. Fiona is a professor of architecture practice at the University of Edinburgh and a partner in E.F. McLachlan Architects. And Ewen McLachlan is a partner in E.F. McLachlan Architects and holds qualifications in architecture and psychology. So we'll take those 2 presentations first, and I'd like you to join with me in welcoming all our speakers to this panel.
I just want to know, have any of you heard of the term knolling? Anyone? No. Okay. Well, you should. Knolling is the process of organizing objects into parallel or 90-degree angles. The term has even infiltrated popular culture. Just look it up. You'll see thousands of examples on Instagram. You can find, for example, people knolling guitars, knolling light bulbs. People are knolling camping supplies. They're even knolling car parts and even knolling food. I don't see people cool housing or hadiding or grimshying. So the influence of knoll, as skewed as it is here to stay. Now, how does this come about? The term first was used in 1987 by Andrew Cromwell, who was a janitor at Frank Gehry's furniture fabrication shop. And at the time, Gehry was designing chairs for Knoll, a company famously known for Florence Knoll's angular furniture. And you can even see one of her chairs out in the exhibition. Cromwell would arrange any displaced tools at right angles on all surfaces. And he called this routine knolling, in that the tools were arranged in right angles similar to Florence Knoll's furniture. The American sculptor Tom Sachs spent 2 years in Gehry's shop as a fabricator and adopted the use of the term from Cromwell. And nowadays, knolling is integral to his process. So the design DNA of this term can be traced back to one person. And that person is Florence Knoll, the subject of my talk today. It's perfect timing that we're celebrating her today at this conference, celebrating 100 years of women in architecture at the AA, because Florence Knoll, too, celebrated her 100th birthday in May earlier this year. I'd like to start with a quote that Florence Knoll first said in 1949. "Good design is the sum of a designer's experience. It results from the ability to analyze and solve problems by organized thinking and imagination." Now, what does this all mean? To understand her philosophy, I think you have to really understand the background of her life and work. Let's start from the beginning. She was born as Florist Schust in 1917 in Saginaw, Michigan, the child of Frederick Schust and Mina Haste. Her father's family were owners of a very successful baking company that eventually merged with the Loose Wiles Sunshine Biscuit Company. She essentially became a biscuit heiress. Here is a picture of Florence at the age of about 4, and Shoe, that was her nickname. And she here took scissors and cut her hair herself. It was her first design act, she said. Sadly, Shoe was orphaned at the age of 12 by the death of her mother in 1931, and her father had died when she was 5, so Florence, or Shoe, was taken in hand by a guardian who guided her to her girls' school, which was at Kingswood, which is part of Cranbrook. Between 1932 and 34, Shoe attended the Kingswood, it's the girls' school that was part of Cranbrook outside of Detroit, Michigan. Cranbrook was run by the Finnish-born Eliel Saarinen, and she ended up studying architecture and design there. Not unlike the German Bauhaus, in some respects, Cranbrook was an artist colony and school which by the 1930s had become one of the centers of modernism in design and architecture in the US, training the likes of Eero Saarinen, Charles and Ray Eames, Harry Bertoia, and Ralph Rapson. Eliel and his textile designer wife, Loya Saarinen, recognized Shoe's talent and brought her under the wing of their family. Cranbrook presented a holistic approach to design that Florence carried forth with her. It was here where every day she was exposed to the handcrafted textiles on the walls and floors, whether it was just by walking to class or by eating in the dining room in front of a huge tapestry that had been handwoven by Loya Saarinen. There she became fascinated with the building itself, and when the Saarinens learned of her interests, they virtually adopted her as part of the family. Later at Cranbrook, Shoe continued her studies in design, being the youngest student ever in the history of the academy to be accepted at the school, still a record to this day. It was at Eero Saarinen's suggestion that she designed her dorm room and experimented with her first ideas of space planning. The room includes a chair designed by Eero for the school, and Shoe designed the built-in desk and combination sofa bed, and the striped carpet, textiles, and the wall hanging with a geometric motif were influenced by the work of Loya Saarinen, but which were handwoven by Shoe. It's in this room where you get this idea of bringing in the warm and fuzzy feeling of Cranbrook through the combination and use of textiles and materials. The Saarinen family quickly took to Shoe as a teenager, and she was unofficially adopted by them, traveling with them to Finland every summer, where they stayed at Vitrusk, the Saarinen summer house and studio outside of Helsinki. Here again, she's influenced by the fully integrated interior spaces of this house with all its handcrafted textiles, rugs, and wall coverings. She attended Columbia University in 1935 for a year, where she met Le Corbusier, who lectures at the university. He even signed her copy of La Ville Radieuse. She was only 18 when she met him, and she decided to leave the university because the curriculum, which was still in a Beaux-Arts style, did not interest her. So she goes back to Finland, and one summer with the Saarinens, Alvar Aalto was a guest for lunch, and he suggested that she go to the Architectural Association to continue her studies. During the summer of 1938, she continues her studies at the AA, enrolled in the Advanced Studies course, where she arrives at the atmosphere at the AA is exciting. The AA had done away with the Beaux-Arts system and taken on more modernist and progressive approach. In part using the unit system, using teamwork, and research and planning is part of the new curriculum. She was put in the second year, Unit 6 in the winter 1938 term. She works on projects such as a house near London and also the garden of a house, getting top marks for her work, and she had crits with architects like Tecton and Maxwell Fry. And while she was here, Ove Arup was lecturing on advanced concrete design. Of the 29 students who entered the school in the winter term of 1938, only 4 were women, including Miss J. N. Miles of Portsmouth, Miss Wallace, and Anne Vanek, who in 1940 married the architect Peter Morrow. National Archives has an interview with Peter Morrow, who talks about working as an architect with Tecton and Lubutkin during the 1930s. And it would be really great to see her contribution, because he really doesn't talk about her in the 15-part interview. Here's another project she did in the spring of 1939 term, which was for a Sussex pub, again, very modernistic. And then in the third year, she works on a project to design a restaurant. This is a cafe that she does called Cafe USA. She wrote, there's one letter to her former teacher, Rachel Rosman, a Cornell-trained architect who taught her interior design and architecture at Cranbrook. She writes, I made a decision, I just have to make this a little smaller. I made a decision to come here to the AA from Finland this summer and have been very pleased about it ever since, as London has promise and success in every way. I'm thoroughly enjoying the work and learning a bit about construction, which is my purpose in coming here. I shall probably finish in about 2 years, as it was placed in the middle upon arrival. Okay. She then goes on to say, London has been working full speed the last few days to blanket herself in snow for a more convincing Christmas, and it looks ever so charming. However, it's a city of frozen waste. The cold temperature is a record one. Thank God I have a flat in a modern building. She moved into Russell Court, which had just been built the year before. Which reminds me, Richard, could you please send me some details of the American system of plumbing and the drainage system in the wall? They're a bit medieval in that respect here. Please excuse this subject, but it's rather important, as I had a row with a cocky sort of lecturer on plumbing the other day. This is very Shu. Here's a paste up of a project that Shu did in the late 1950s. But I'm showing it here in the context because it was at the AA where she started to use small pieces of textiles that were pasted into her projects and using fabrics and materials on a rendering so that you get a sense of the color and texture of the materials used. And also note how she's knolling the furniture. So the war breaks out and Florence Knoll returns to the US and called Marcel Breuer and offered to intern at Breuer and Gropius's office. They were partners at this time, before the war in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And what's interesting here is that she worked on one of their largest residential projects in the US, which is the Frank House. It's a huge house, over 12,000 square feet, and was designed for an engineer and his family. It had 9 bedrooms, 13 bathrooms, and is one of their biggest residences ever. Gropius and Breuer designed everything for the house, including the interior furnishings and hardware. The amazing thing is that it is virtually the same today as it was built in 1939-40, totally original and authentic. It's still in the hands of the son, and it's in Pittsburgh. Annie Albers did the textiles, and Shu worked on the children's bedrooms. To compare, the average house in Pittsburgh at the time cost $12,000 to build. Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water cost $250,000 to build that year. And this house cost $2 million in 1939. It's a spectacular house, and the son is trying to get it preserved. But locals in Pittsburgh, I think, don't just understand it. So 1940, she enrolls as a grad student at the Armour Institute in Chicago with Mies van der Rohe, who became another seminal influence on her. She was one of the few female graduate students in the Department of Architecture, and according to Shu, Mies had a profound effect on her design approach and the clarification of design. After graduating, she moves Florence Knoll moves from Chicago to New York. And around 1943, she started working for Hans Knoll, and in 46, they married and they began to reshape the company as Knoll Associates, with Florence Knoll as an equal partner. At this point, I should give you some background on Hans Knoll. If we look at the early years of Hans Knoll, he was the son of Walter Knoll, a leading furniture manufacturer just outside of Stuttgart, Germany. And although he was German-born in 1935, he joined architect Serge Chermayev, who had a furniture company, an interiors company called Plan Limited in London, that manufactured and sold German modernist design furniture. It goes bankrupt basically in 1937, and Hans Knoll has to decide, does he go back to Germany, or what does he do? He decides instead, 1937, at the age of 23, to immigrate to the United States, and he did so in part because of his disagreements with his father over his father's strong support of the Nazi Party. One of his brothers died during the war, and the other brother ended up in a Russian labor camp by the end of the war. So there was a split in the family over the ideology. It appears, though, Hans may have been considering the move across the Atlantic for some time, he was following the path of many European modernist designers who sought refuge in the US during the late 30s. Here's, for example, a furniture catalog by Knoll in 1940, and you can really see, this is before she joined the company, the type of furniture that Hans Knoll was developing, rather plain graphics in terms of the catalog, overstuffed furniture, uninspired patterned upholstery, and it really was here where Knoll was just becoming a company that was just selling furniture and not design. Only when Shoe becomes involved does branding, designing of the company take on a more integrated approach in selecting the furniture design and other products. So Hans was not without his problems. Around 1945, Hans tried to market his furniture in Bloomingdale's. That got him into some trouble as he owed money, a lot of it, to some agents, and Shoe, who was just an employee at the time, went to her trust fund and got the $50,000 and bailed him out. By doing so, she effectively became co-owner of the company. And in 1949, the Hans G. Knoll Furniture Company changed its name to Knoll Associates. She always said she was the associate in Knoll Associates. And the following year, they were married. Meanwhile, in just a few short years, they were really able to really transform the company. The Knoll Planning Unit, founded as a division of Knoll, provided clients for the first time a design service separate from the selling of furniture. This was kind of really brilliant because instead of just selling furniture, they would now sell the services to the client. They would sell the furniture, the textiles, and they would really sell the whole package. And if you look at other companies like Herman Miller, they're still just selling furniture. So was Florence Knoll more so than Hans, who was well connected with leading designers in the US? One of Shoe's earliest published interiors was a recreation lounge for defense workers at an aircraft plant in 1943, and we're seeing where she's taking the Knoll furniture in that line and using them in a spatial way. The Knolls started a program of designing case study housing, much like the case study projects that were happening in Los Angeles. They commissioned architects such as Ralph Rapson, Charlie Eames, Serge Chermayev, and Lou Kahn to design prefab houses and the furniture inside. This is just one sketch in a series of over 44 sketches designed by Lou Kahn for his Parasol house for Knoll. Incidentally, Lou Kahn's partner at the time, Ann Ting, who had just recently graduated from the Harvard Graduate School of Design, got a job working in the Knoll Planning Unit at the time. The Knolls also worked on top secret projects. Sometimes Shoe didn't know what she was working on. She was actually working on a project but didn't know what it was going to end up or where it was going to end up for the US government. But this is one that Hans Knoll worked on, and it was the German Village, which was the nickname for a range of mock residential houses constructed in 1943 in Dugway, Utah, in order to conduct experiments used for bombing of Nazi Germany. So they were building houses. Mendelsohn was building the structure, Eric Mendelsohn, the architect. And Hans Knoll was responsible for finding the kind of furniture and textiles that a typical German would live in these houses. And what they did was they tested different types of gases, and in fact, the early first uses of napalm was used on this. She did work on large projects such as creating housing for American overseas personnel in cities across Asia and the Middle East. So places like Jeddah, Karachi, Pakistan, Saigon, and so forth. You can see all those X's. And if you look at the checklist, there's cities like Monrovia, Tehran, Rangoon, Singapore, Dhaka, and Lahore. The idea was to create about 55 prefab houses, and Shu would design and specify everything in the house down to the curtains and the cups and saucers. Everything was packed into containers and shipped overseas to their destinations. You'll see the list of A, B, C, D. So there were 4 versions of the same house, and you'll see a line through Karachi, Pakistan, because the shipping container that had all the furniture for Karachi, when it was being unloaded, fell into the Arabian Sea. So somewhere at the bottom of the Arabian Sea is a container full of Knoll furniture. One version would have, for example, here's the one on the big one has the blue sofa with the yellow curtains. The next version would have a brown sofa with the red curtains. And the idea was that Shu didn't want people living in the same city having the same looking house. So she, even within this idea of standardization, she's really affecting some variety. So she was on the lookout for fresh talent and people from Europe who were not well known in the US. You have people connected to Cranbrook, like Harry Bertoia, who trained as a jeweler, Ralph Rapson, Antoinette Prestini, and of course, Eero Saarinen. And then she worked with whole international architects and designers, Hans Bellman, Mies van der Rohe, Ilmari Tapio-Vara, Pierre Jeanneret. So she met Korb, but she doesn't want to work with him, and instead chooses to work with Pierre Jeanneret, who she felt was really the guy in Korb's office who was the one doing all the furniture. Charlotte Perriand also designs furniture for Knoll, but she gets those designs and she doesn't think, they were really designs from the 30s, and she really didn't think they were sort of fitting into the Knoll look. That was something that was really more modern and contemporary. And remember, she does this all by 1951, and she was just 34 years old. So Shu even brought in from her former teacher, Mies van der Rohe, and asked him if Knoll could reproduce his furniture. So if you look at his furniture production during the 1920s, he did a number of metal furniture for the Tugendhat House, the Barcelona Pavilion, and some other residential projects, and she only picks a few of his designs. She wasn't interested in Mies's chairs that use tubular furniture, like the MR chair, the little X. But for her, what was more Miesian was the Barcelona chair. So she could even look at Mies's work and see Mies in Mies. Because the Barcelona chair has rolled steel, polished steel, handcrafted, and that to her was really the essence of Mies. Even when you look on the bottom, the Burnout chair, that's tubular, so when it's being redesigned for the Four Seasons, they use flat steel, rolled steel instead. Later, Shu commissions another Cranbrook graduate, Harry Bertoia, to design a line of furniture. She saw these pieces, as well as the other pieces by other designers like Mies and Saarinen, as the sculptural pieces. And although she never saw herself as a furniture designer, she does not consider herself a furniture designer. She designed over 130 pieces of furniture in the Knoll line that were put into production at some time in the company's history. And she called these pieces the fill-in pieces. So furniture was a crucial element in the design of a good interior. Here you can see that she patented the tufting on a cushion for her sofa. So she hated the idea of buttons because they caught in your jacket or they were always popping off the sofa. But her solution is also a very elegant one and a rational one on this kind of gridded plane. So a very architectural solution. During the 1940s, when fabrics were hard to get, Schuh first used men's suiting fabrics like tweeds and flannels and neutrals that came from men's tailors. Paul Smith does this, with Maharam today, maybe 10 years ago, and she was doing this in the 40s, until they were able to start making their own fabrics. So at first they used textiles from Sweden with patterns by designers such as Sven Markelius, architect, Stig Lindberg and Astrid Sempe, and over a decade and a half worked with 50 different fabric designers. And if you look even at the little square samples, she was a pioneer who started the 3x3-inch sample. So this was another standard that she started in the industry for sampling. Architecture, you see, starts here with the smallest scale. So Knoll did work with just a few British designers during the post-war period. One reason why the Knoll brand was not well promoted in the UK is because there was a trademark conflict. There was another company called Parker Knoll, which did sort of traditional furniture, and they sued them, and so it was difficult for Knoll to really promote the Knoll brand, even though the two company styles were completely different. So on the bottom is a yellow and black sequence tile by the British abstract painter Paul Mellon, introduced in 1950 before she becomes sort of known or famous. Then you have a textile design by the British architect Dennis Lennon called Shoji. And Lennon had worked in the office of Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew. And at the time this textile was made, Lennon had recently hired a young design student, Terence Conran, to work in his office. And since Conran was the only designer in Lennon's office doing textiles, this textile is also probably designed by Terence Conran. Both Conran and Lennon share their enthusiasm for contemporary modern design and use the Eameses and Knoll as really influential in their design. So we have their showroom, 601 Madison, and really these showrooms were the laboratory for where Schuh could really experiment with space planning because it wasn't client-based. So 601 Madison, here she uses a wall of abstraction, or else in the back you see the textiles hanging as abstract squares. And during the late 1940s and early 50s, the showroom had murals by Swiss artists and designers like Max Bill, had paintings by Paul Klee, Jackson Pollock, and Alexander Calder, of course. Here you can see the next image of her next showroom at 575 Madison, and it was really designed like a Mondrian painting. You can see this idea carried through in different cities, such as the San Francisco showroom, the Miami Knoll showroom, and the LA showroom, which was seen specifically to be seen while driving in a car. Here's an example of her paste up for Hans Knoll's showroom. So if you look at it, you'll see that she's using all the materials and textures, but then also if we look at the little swatches, it really reflects this idea of how you can translate that, which was a pioneering element. But then she also is doing something where she's flipping the space. So the table in the front is where, and in the back you have a cabinet where you can really store things now. So she's really starting to be more efficient in space planning. But there was another reason, the black wall, the textures, the kind of blonde materials was used because Hans Knoll had fair skin and blonde hair, and it made him look really good against this black background. So the idea of designing for human-centered design was central to all our spaces. And if you start looking at them very carefully, they really look the same in a way sometimes. There's a similarity, but then there's a lot of difference. In a very few short years, Florence Knoll, with her work, started to work on corporate offices and designs for everything from hotels, corporate offices, hospitals. On my left is a dormitory, for example, that she did. This is her apartment in New York. Connecticut General was one of her biggest projects done with Gordon Bunshaft. And what was interesting there is there was this back and forth. And with Gordon Bunshaft, they didn't have a planning unit, interiors, unit. Okay, we're getting near the end. And what happened was Bunshaft's office was inspired by the Knoll planning unit, and they based their interiors division on the Knoll planning unit. This is one of my favorite pictures of Shu. Here she is in the middle of an interior design presentation at Connecticut General. She really is owning the room. She uses this picture as an example to show how the conservative nature of a lot of her clients, who were old New England bankers and life insurance executives, were able to convince and embrace this new form of modern design and architecture. Hans Knoll dies in a car crash in 1955, and Shu takes over. And what's really interesting here, this was the first time a woman was featured in the business section of the New York Times, and Shu chooses to have her picture taken with Eero Saarinen, a collaborator, but also to promote this new furniture, part of the tulip chair. Let me just skip to the last one. So Florence Knoll looked at the challenge of designing an interior as an architectural solution, one that was more than just specifying furniture and fabrics. Her contribution to contemporary design is that she was a great collaborator, making architects' buildings look great from the outside in, and also in working with furniture designers and artists to create design classics that are still popular today. She's one of the few architects and designers to win the top art awards from the various design professions, such as the AIA, ASID, and even the Graphic and Interior Design Associations. So hope you like her work, and I think it's a fitting tribute to her on this 100th anniversary of the AA.
Thanks, thank you. It's a great pleasure for us to be able to give a short talk about Karla Kowalski, who's someone who's very important to us. She and her partner, Michał Szyszkiewicz, seen here, exemplify much that's positive about architecture and its relationship to its users and inhabitants. Their work embodies a worldview that's open, generous, life-affirming, and despite all the usual pressures that bear down on any practicing architect, never cynical. Karla Kowalski is an architect, artist, and educator, and she studied here at the Architectural Association in the late 1960s before working in the office of Günter Behnisch. She co-founded the practice of Szyszkiewicz and Kowalski in Graz, southern Austria, in 1978. Despite the city's relatively isolated setting on the edge of what was then Western Europe, Graz has experienced an astonishing blossoming of architectural creativity since the 1980s. Szyszkiewicz-Kowalski was one of the principal leaders in this, and Karla's contribution to the character, professionalism, and output of her practice is indivisible from that of her partner. Their instantly recognizable work still continues, despite Michał's recent untimely death. They first became more widely appreciated following a traveling exhibition that represented the output of a loose grouping of individuals and practices who were the catalyst of the city's new architecture, the so-called Grazer Schule. Karla was notably the sole female representative of the group. As a byproduct of its success, her office has employed and nurtured successive generations of architects in Graz, and so continued to strengthen its architectural community. Happily, women now have a stronger leading role in the city's architectural offices, and they've been able to benefit from and draw on Karla's pioneering position. Szyszkiewicz-Kowalski has produced an extensive and notable body of buildings and projects, many won through competition. Their works emerged from the zeitgeist that pursued alternatives to late modernism and opened a space in which more individual architectural expressions could flourish. Their early buildings demonstrated the partners' ability not only to develop sophisticated compositions, but also to do so in a way that conversed with a given site, that carefully considered how people might interact with structures and materials, and demonstrated maturity in resolving aesthetic and technical aspects through carefully crafted detailing. Karla Kowalski's design philosophy and reading of history are mediated through her drawings, but she's foremost an architect. She's built prolifically, and her design ideas are manifested in the strongly expressive forms, colours and details of her practice's constructions. These are overtly confident buildings, not ones that make a virtue of being insipid. Yet despite its idiosyncratic design ethos, it's hard to overstate how impressively broad the practice's portfolio is in both scale and programme. It includes residential, commercial, cultural and educational developments, and their client base extends across Austria and Germany. The practice has completed many single-family houses in Graz and Vienna, and these encapsulate the density of the partner's thinking. Each house takes a specific approach to its location, whether following existing contours or constructing a new artificial landscape or being set in counterpoint to its surroundings. These same principles apply equally to the practice's larger buildings. While the use of strong forms is a consistent theme, layouts, details and specifications are not simply repeated from one project to the next, even when a similar typology is called for. Each project, big or small, is interrogated according to its particular set of constraints and opportunities, and so results in an individual response. Their house interiors tend to use distinctive non-orthogonal forms and volumes, often linking rooms and circulation areas and carving out informal spaces that people can colonise. But they're not bland, blank canvases. Frank Werner wrote that, quote, "Szyszkiewicz and Kowalski's buildings are not cold architecture, they leave space for and encourage emotion," unquote. Inhabitants are welcomed as active contributors to a living architecture rather than awkward afterthoughts who might intrude on or upset an overprecious architectural concept. The practice's urban work has developed a dialogue between modern insertions and historical context. Szyszkiewicz-Kowalski approaches their opportunities to build in this context in the manner of Patrick Geddes. That is to say, they knowingly add to and subtract from the built fabric, inserting contemporary buildings that draw on pre-existing forms, colours and roofscapes. They also clarify existing structures and open up routes and spaces to add permeability, extending and enhancing the legibility of the found situation. The office has often been extremely daring. Part of the regeneration shown here of a department store in Graz involved excavating a 7-storey deep car park below the historical city centre and immediately adjacent to a river to entice shoppers back into the town centre. Their boldness is seen in other ways too. They have constructed extensions to historic schlosses that sit in architectural conversations with the old buildings. They've engaged deeply with the programmatic complexities of public participation housing models and have developed complex detailing to ensure that their architectural concepts function ecologically in the extremes of subalpine sun and snow. The combination of the formal and informal in Szyszkiewicz-Kowalski's buildings is an important theme. The evident irregularity of external form is always pinned by a clear structural and organisational strategy. Many of their buildings develop from a constructional system or grid overlaid with cross and sub-axes and asymmetrical elements. Structural bays are then enclosed or opened out and additional layers added to soften and add complexity to the strictness of the initial geometry. These allow the viewer a choice of orientations and scales at which the final building can be read. The interrelationship of form and function are fully explored. Andrea Gleiniger wrote that their, quote, "poetic features aim to recover the sensory experience that has largely departed from functional construction," unquote. Their buildings bulge out where space is claimed internally or twist and fall with the site, but always with a knowing degree of manipulation relative to a clear underlying morphology. The finer detailing of individual building elements emphasises the main conceptual ideas, such as solidity, openness, or enclosure. I'll swap over.
Karla Kowalski is a skilled artist. These stunning but delicate landscape sketches on Japanese paper demonstrate her ability to observe the strength and dynamism of nature's forms. but they also evince a finer eye that can perceive and appreciate small details and the contribution they make to the whole. One reading of Kowalski's buildings is as extensions to the landscape, acting as topographical insertions to the urban or rural settings. In this perception, roofscapes echo hill formations, built structures form cliffs, crags, or valleys. While there are obvious suggestions of this, the greatest value in the work is in its ability to shape environments that provide public and private enclosures with which people can identify and within which they can live at ease with themselves and their surroundings. In this, the use of finer elements such as columns, staircases, and canopies that bring the scale down to that of the individual inhabitant are just as essential as the more immediately obvious elevational arrangements. Seen in photographs, perhaps their building's most obvious trademark is their formal expression. Yet Peter Blundell-Jones wrote that, quote, "Much of the time it distracts from the real ingenuity of the work. The photographs are certainly striking, but the work is, in real life, often better, offering more," unquote. The logistics of delivering buildings is always intense and fraught with the contradictory demands of clients, contractors, funders, and regulations. An even greater concentration of resources and will is required to produce a commercially viable architecture that is based on a highly individual, crafted response to each project. Part of the success of Kowalski's career has been due to the administrative and constructional professionalism through which they have expressed their artistic and social ideas. The practice's designs knowingly absorb historical elements, from Italian churches to the Baroque to the English country garden. Their output is not exactly a number of things: anthropomorphic, neo-expressionist, regionalist. What it is a very personal expression of the partners' worldviews, or more accurately, their singular combined worldview. Kowalski considers that architecture is fundamentally a perpetual search, quote, "to generate a home on earth," unquote. This strand of building as dwelling runs through her architectural work, and her designs explore the reciprocal relationship between built form and human somatic and psychological experience. The aim is to deliver an emotional as well as physical identity, an architecture, as suggested by Wolfgang Scheche, that possesses a kind of soul, unquote. Over a number of years, Karla Kowalski has created and exhibited a menagerie of large, hand-sculpted hybrid ceramic beasts that extend the animalistic concepts hinted at in many of her office's buildings. She considers that they, quote, "stand on their pedestals at home and think deep thoughts, and voice the things for which there are no verbal explanations," unquote. These so-called monsters show a breadth of artistic thinking that underpins her architectural work, but also, importantly, demonstrates the inquisitiveness and sense of humour that permeates her thinking. What if a tapir was half-dressed or half-shaved? Karla Kowalski has received recognition for her work through numerous building awards and many publications and exhibitions of her practice's output. In 2009, the Akademie der Künste in Berlin recognized the significance of the practice's output by acquiring an archive, including sketches, technical drawings, and models. This is available for scholars to contemplate and perhaps to begin to unravel its significance. I'm just reminded about the conversation yesterday and how important archiving is, so that's something to celebrate. Beyond her practice, she was appointed professor at the Faculty of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Stuttgart, and a post she held for 15 years. So while some of its roots may be glimpsed, looking forward, it's almost impossible to see how other architects could develop Kowalski's style without the catalysing influence of the partners. Karla's work, together with Michael Szyszkiewicz, does not self-consciously place itself in an architectural ism or school. Their work deploys specific artistic and organisational responses to place and brief, rather than the pursuit of mainstream theory. As such, it sits awkwardly in the kind of architectural history that likes to trace a chronological lineage between styles. Instead, it occupies a space reserved for those whose artistic sensibility is overlaid with a sense of a desire to build. Kowalski's architecture is grounded in her observations of nature and built forms. It views urban, public, and domestic structures as enclosures that have the potential to enrich people's physical and emotional well-being through the architect's empathy with those who inhabit and engage with them. This is as worthwhile an aim as architecture can aspire to. Karla Kowalski's work is highly thoughtful. It rejects the position of the architect as someone detached and intellectually superior. Instead, it uses the balance of tensions between old and new, nature and culture, formality and informality, to mould places where people can dwell as individuals and as part of society. Her drawings, models, sculptures and buildings demonstrate an undoubted artistic drive and technical skill. The true measure and depth of Karla Kowalski's output, however, lies in its expression in the joy of life, a sense of humour, and most importantly, its aim to manifest through architecture her deeply held soulful and human-centred ideals. Thank you.
So we've got some time just to have some questions for those individual papers, and one thing that just struck me immediately is obviously we all have our own motivations for choosing the people that we work on and the reasons why, and I'm just kind of intrigued how you were led to these architects and why you're working on them, what you want to do with thinking about their histories.
Karla's very important. Karla and Michael were very important to us because when we were students, I wrote a dissertation on Günther Domenig, another of the Graz architects, and we went out to Graz and just looked around, and they were very good about showing us their buildings and basically
fed us when we were very
fed us and all the things that you'd hope people would do with students.
Yeah.
From that we just continued. They've been across here, viewed across there, and just continue to keep an interest in their buildings.
So there's personal history.
I think it's personal history, but it was also, we talked a lot about yesterday about role models and so on, and this morning was really interesting about the role model of the partnership. And I think for us as developing architects, setting up our own practice, authority was really important, actually understanding that joint authority from the start. And in their case, that's what they always did. Everything was always duly credited, and I think for us that was really important. That we never did anything that wasn't duly credited. So that was also.
And it would be important for Karla giving this talk to say that it was indivisible between her and Michael, because that's how they presented it.
What about you, Paul?
For me, I was working at Metropolis. I was a senior editor there, and I sat at a desk and I had to come up with ideas. And because I really didn't know what I was supposed to do, I was given this job. And I remember thinking, Florence Knoll, she's a sofa designer, and how come we have never heard an interview with, or read an interview with her? And when she resigned from Knoll in 1965, she basically stopped doing interviews, refused to talk to the press, and really, retired into private life. I was able to get an interview with her, and she really liked the story. And thereafter, we became pen pals, and then we became very good friends. One of the things about credit that I think is really interesting was that at Knoll, the whole brand was based on giving credit to designers and really building up the brand of these individual designers like Eero Saarinen and Bertoya. They could have easily have had one mono brand and just said this is, like IKEA or whatever. But she really made that a point to give each of those individual designers credit and royalties, and then promote each one.
Open the floor for questions if there's one here, lady in the red jumper.
What you just said about accreditation within Knoll, I think that links back to her Finnish links. If you take Marimekko, for instance, all the textile designs, they have the signature of the designer in the margin printed into the textile. And that is so empowering and motivating for staff working within a larger organization.
Very true. And then even designers in the Knoll planning unit, if they did a certain piece of furniture, Lou Butler, Charlie Niedringhaus, they got credit and they were promoted as well. André Dupré, a French designer who's only done one thing in his life, the string chair in the 40s, also has gotten credit. So she gave credit to actual people on staff. So the Knoll planning unit as a team for collaboration was very important, never more than 6 or 8 people. And the interesting thing is, when she leaves Knoll, the Knoll planning unit is taken over by Lou Butler, one of her favorite and longest people in the planning unit. And he tries to replicate what Florence Knoll has done for 5 years after that. They work on a big project for Westinghouse, but then they can't replicate it afterwards. And then the Knoll planning unit is dispersed. And Knoll goes back to being a company that sells furniture and not the whole services.
Other questions? Well, there's one here.
Hi, I wanted to ask, or I want to say both of those presentations were really, really, really inspiring, so thank you. You talk about Florence being inspired or having met Corp, and it looks like she was inspired by him. I wonder, did she ever mention women that she was inspired by who were doing a sort of similar thing at the same time? Like, so I was thinking of someone like Eileen Gray, who seemed to have been doing...
No, it's, Loya Saarinen, Eliel Saarinen's wife, who really taught her about weaving. That was an important person. But most of the architects who she had close relationships with, like Aalto or Eliel Saarinen or Mies was really somebody who really transformed and really helped codify a lot of her thinking. She had women friends in the sense, like Noemi Raymond, Antoinine Raymond's wife. Antoinine Raymond's an interesting architect who's modernist. They do work in Japan and come back. So she does textiles for Knoll. So there were these kinds of friendships. But really on the architectural side, it was clearly men. Charlotte Perrion produces designs for Knoll. Generet basically is writing back to her because he comes over for 6 months, and says there's a small American company that wants to produce modern, contemporary design. She sends designs, but they're really designs from the 1930s, like the stool that she does, tubular furniture. And Florence Knoll doesn't think it's right for the new brand, for where Knoll is going.
I had a question about what we've seen in the presentations, and just Fiona, you made the point about Karla being an amazing artist as well, and the kind of diversity of her practice. And it's sort of, just thinking, and again, perhaps this is motivated by me as being an art historian, what gets included in the archive? What are the records, what are the materials that contribute to the history of somebody's career, and whether those objects are seen within her practice as an architect or as something that's slightly outside of that. It's just thinking about the kinds of materials that go towards creating a history of someone's career.
I think it's really interesting because recently there's a book called Monsters, which effectively documents the hand drawings and the monsters. But before that, I think Karla sort of almost did that to keep her sane. It was almost kind of something that she did out with the office, and almost she was kind of reluctant to necessarily make them public for some time. But I think they were things that you came across in the house, really. But I think now recently, I think she's beginning to understand more even of herself that there's this relationship between. To me, always, if you look at the forms and you look at the detail, there's so much connection between the different practices. So between the drawings, between the sculptures, between the buildings, there's evidence of quite significant crossover. I don't know if the monsters are in the heart.
There was obviously a rigorous selection procedure, and the Academy der Künste went to Graz and sifted through. I mean, as all architects have, not sure if this sketch is significant or not, and that's something that you obviously, a professional archivist, can say, well, actually, we think that is. It's an interesting question about whether the monsters made it to that or not. I'm not sure, to be honest. I mean, I've seen publications, but I'll ask the question.
Thank you. Well, I think just for the sake of time, we'll move on to the next two papers, but hopefully we'll have time to kind of weave together, make all these connections between our papers. But thank you again for your papers. I'll just briefly introduce our next two speakers in this panel. We have Dr. Ellen Rowley, who's an architectural historian based in Dublin, and she looks primarily at 20th century Ireland, and is someone who is very much invested in thinking about histories through museums, and is currently developing the new Tenement Museum in Dublin. And find my next. And then our second paper in the second half of the panel is Suzanne Ewing, who is Senior Lecturer at the Edinburgh School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. And so I'd like you to join with me in welcoming them to the panel.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Lynn, for organising an inspiring, wonderful conference and exhibition and book. So my presentation is I suppose in stark contrast to the more canonical and prolific figures that we've been looking at this morning or in this session. And it considers the position of women in the past in Irish architecture, but through the micro history, very much through the hidden history. And it stands, I suppose, when I look at this character and this work, as I have done once in Ireland, once or twice with students, I put her as in a kind of a binary position with Eileen Gray, who's always pulled out as the Irish woman architect, but who left Enniscorthy in 1898 and never came back. So I'm really into kind of the whole business of bread and butter, hidden histories. So it's the beginning of research into women and architecture in Ireland, asking questions of Irish society and its architectural culture, which since the 1980s, as you all know, has produced internationally acclaimed practices with women partners. O'Donnell Toomey, Grafton architects, and also McCullum Mulvin, and the granddaughter of today's hero, Ruth O'Herlihy, is a director of McCullum Mulvin. And this paper, today's hero, not this paper's hero rather, is Maureen Hope. And so this is a discussion of some of the work that she was an agent or some kind of conduit for. In October 1940, just as war was raging in Europe, Ireland's first nursery school opened in an impoverished, slum-ridden corner of Dublin. Olive Frost, aged 4, and Bernadette Timmins, aged 2.5, became the first children to attend. The account informs us that Olive was a slight child, while red-haired Bernadette, one of a family of 12, quote, has personality. She rebelled against sleeping in a rest bed, but slumbered peacefully when taken on anyone's lap, unquote. Design and colour were central to the nursery from the outset, so that each child had a motif embroidered on their towel and overalls. Olive selected a blue cat, while appropriately, according to our account, little Bernadette chose the 3 little pigs. As a neutral country, newly independent since the 1920s, and having just redrafted its constitution in 1937 so as to reflect its deeply Catholic and family-oriented nature, Ireland was able, during the early 1940s, to consider civic improvement. The nursery in question, St. Bridget's, was an endeavour of the Ladies' Committee of the Civics Institute, a philanthropic organisation intent upon Dublin's inter alia moral improvement. The Civics Institute was simply a group of civic-minded individuals, numbering about 100, very much inspired, as the previous speakers mentioned, Patrick Geddes, the physicalism of Geddes. In 1914, the Institute instigated a major competition for a town plan for Dublin and an exhibition, leading to Patrick Abercrombie's city plan, which was the foundation of town planning as a discipline in Ireland. And in this image, this is the publication from that 1914, published in 1922 as Ireland gained independence. And the frontispiece is an engraving by Harry Clarke, where we see the city conceived of as a personification of a diseased creature, touching the decrepit tenement, Georgian building, and then these three structures of neoclassical imperial power, which are all ablaze, which have been damaged in the course of the struggle for Irish independence, preceding this up to 1922. Within this idea, we have the idea for Ireland for the first time of the moral authority of the architect to cure the diseased city, which is very much something coming through the Civics Institute and very original for Ireland at this moment. Through the 1920s and 30s, the Institute kept the housing question and slum clearance alive. It founded the first social studies course at Trinity College. It founded probation services, patient welfares, in hospitals, the Irish Catholic Association and more, the Irish Country Women's Association, the ICA. Possibly its most visible and least known legacy was Dublin's playgrounds. From the 1930s, the Civics Institute are custodians of children's public play spaces on behalf of the public authority Dublin Corporation, and this continues until the 1980s. This more nuanced and focused interest for the Civics Institute highlighted its pursuit of better life for urban Irish children. Of course, for the social reformer, street play is seen as a symptom of social disorganisation to be countered by planning playgrounds. In a letter to the editor of the Irish Times in 1930, two of the Civics Institute members called for us generally in Ireland to attend to the needs of children, that they have nowhere to play. And that by making playgrounds we will have, quote, better public morals, because children who are happily playing under supervision will not ultimately become juvenile delinquents. The Civics Institute sought figures from the Irish police force, the Gardaí, around child fatalities and street accidents during the year 1931, and indeed 36 children under the age of 12 lost their life on the streets, Dublin. When renowned architect and town planner Manning Robertson was the Institute's chairman, one of the most active protagonists and indeed the main designers of the Civics Institute playgrounds and subsequent nurseries was architect Maureen Hope, née Cuff. Here she is with her girls at the drawing board. Looking at new archive material around the voluntary design work of Maureen Hope, we begin to draw a portrait of a professional married woman as benevolent mediator of social services. Seeing how Hope, like other married women architects, married women doctors, married women lawyers, married women secretaries in Ireland, were unable to practice until 1973 due to the marriage bar. So the abolition of the marriage bar only comes in 1973. So my mother would have had to give up her job when she got married. As the Irish Constitution stated, quote, this clause 1 in particular, the state recognises that by her life within the home, woman gives to the state a support without which the common good cannot be achieved. And 2, the state shall therefore endeavour to ensure that mothers shall not be obliged by economic necessity to engage in labour to the neglect of their duties in the home. unquote. And I remind you, this is until 1973. Graduating from University College Dublin, UCD, in 1939 from architecture, Cuff married Liverpool-trained English architect Alan Hope, who by the end of the 1940s won the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland the RAI Gold Medal for his Aspro factory from 1948, since demolished in the late 1980s, which is typical of the very reckless behaviour towards 20th century buildings in Ireland. So I suppose most of what I'm doing is a kind of a PR exercise in trying to counter the disdain and public disinterest, active disinterest, dangerous disinterest in 20th century architecture. With this example, we can see how membership in the Civics Institute, oh, hang on, I've skipped something. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I skipped a major part. So Maureen's story is, on the other hand, is not a public one. Unlike her husband, her career does not recount a tale of public commissions, but rather speaks of small-scale backdrops designed to improve conditions for the less well-off. But this is not an oppositional account of wife versus architect husband. Collaboration underpinned Maureen's practice. In the first instance, we encounter her and Alan, and architect friends, designing and building their own Scandi domicile in Foxrock, County Dublin, Meander, from 1939. Inspired by Alto, with concrete block walls clad with cedar boards, and the exterior and plywood lined in the interior. It's completely intact and continues to be lived in by the family today. And you can visit it during the summer months. You can send an email and pop in and see it. At about the same time as Meander, the end of the 1930s and into the 1940s, Maureen Hope is engaged in the design of sand gardens, or sand pits as we might call them, with Manning Robertson and a team headed up by this Captain Coote, part of the Civics Institute. In a letter from Maureen to Robertson, we can see, I'm not going to get into the details, it's just, this is in the Hope Archive, which is a private collection that we're trying to get it out into the public domain. But with this example, with the sand gardens, we can see how membership of the Civics Institute brings the possibility of activism, enabling Maureen and her peers to contribute to public life and social welfare, where alternatively they would have been muted. Here, Maureen is recommending the employment of railway sleepers instead of concrete due to material shortages of the mid-war. She is advising Manning Robertson, who in turn is advising the Office of Public Works, a government body. So a seemingly naive and innocuous route into public policy. Material culture of childhood environments, in this instance, the simple, humble sandpit, becomes a document of social history. While Irish histories have recorded the fight for women's suffrage and the links with the nationalist cause and the socialist battle, like, say, the Dublin women laundry workers' strike of 1945, I'd argue that this is something different, whereby the scaffold of the Civics Institute empowered a genteel, polite, middle to upper class activism that was in practice fearsome and markedly effective, as we'll see in terms of the planning and enduring success of the nursery centres. So about these nurseries, avant-garde for Ireland in that they introduce a brand new social infrastructure. The first to the left is St. Bridget's, the second to the right is St. Joseph's, and they're diminutive, utterly unheroic bread and butter buildings. Architecture with a small a. First of all, St. Bridget's, housed in a converted tennis pavilion in the corner of the public gardens in Mountjoy Square, catering for children aged between 2 and 5, so-called preschool age, and open for children of working mothers who, these children would have alternatively been left to their own devices. This is a fundraising pamphlet from 1941. Importantly, the nursery's central dictum from the outset was that it was not to be a substitute for the family. The social facts coming out very clearly in both reading the Constitution, Catholic diocesan correspondence, and the archive papers of the Civics Institute establish or affirm for me that it was a great source of shame for the mother to have to work. As an early example around the nursery's origin commented, it was embarrassing for women to work long hours and, quote, their children would be lonely and would slip into bad habits owing to lack of supervision and would thus grow up bad citizens. At the same time, there was a reticence coming out of Catholic social teaching for the state to interfere with the workings of the family. So a nursery like this was controversial and laid out in its defence. The Civics Institute stated that it wasn't to interfere with the most natural form of government in Ireland was the family. That was the form destined by nature, they said. And that this nursery was designed to strengthen rather than weaken the spiritual and natural ties of family life, and most especially the intimate link between the mother and her children. The nursery was paid for the first 3 years by an English couple, Mr. and Mrs. Simmons, he was working in insurance, and they had witnessed during several stays in Dublin in the hotel, the Gresham Hotel on O'Connell Street, they'd seen lots of little children looking after little baby brothers and sisters. And at the same time, they had lost their 3-year-old granddaughter. So in her memory, they sought to encourage, quote, good citizens through the workings of the Civics Institute. Maureen Hope's involvement was quite peripheral in the early stages, and the adapted tennis pavilion was a corporation gift. And Hope seems to have been brought in slightly later as the project architect. By the 5th of July 1940, the Civics Institute Secretary, Miss Keane, is recording the making of the creche or the nursery for the benefactors, and she writes in a letter that there's the installation of a new roof and, quote, the workmen are wildly enthusiastic about everything. Not satisfied with the book measurements for fittings, they brought little children in and measured them to ensure correct heights for shelves, seats, etc. So the nursery opens on the 20th of November 1940. Pretty soon after its opening, efforts were being made to make another nursery across the city in another slum-inflicted area of Dublin 8, the Liberties. And this time Hope was strategically placed to spearhead its design from conception. And this is St. Joseph's. The most lengthy correspondence collection charts hundreds of letters written by Hope and some of her colleagues, eliciting building materials and procuring services for free or for cheap. Over £3,000 worth of construction currency was found, which allowed Hope to make a new building here rather than adapt an old existing one. The nursery, as laid out, its floor plan, very simple and clear layout, and it was all about devising a very clear circulation sequence of where to gather, bringing shelter and space for prams, and inside there's this large ceilinged playroom which prioritises cross ventilation, emphasis on natural light, and these timber doorways through the south wall out into this play space, having direct access to garden. And here's an image of the opening with people smoking cigarettes and dropping ash on children's heads. And so, the striking aspect of this endeavour was firstly the apparently selfless pursuit of better conditions. The benevolence of the Ladies' Committee was so low-key, one suspects, so as not to irk the Catholic authorities. And just as an aside, it's interesting that the Archbishop, John Charles McQuaid, was deeply suspicious of the Institute because it was multi-denominational. And he was always trying to get spies in there and try and figure out what's going on. He had a vigilance committee, and he had a guy spying on the Irish Housewives Association and the Teddy Boys of Dublin and things like that. So this isn't made up. This is I've archived material. But I suppose the interest to me was how utterly child-centred this whole endeavour was, motivated by the need to make tiny children independent and competent in their daily chores in the absence of a parent. At a time when Dublin's slums were the worst in urban Europe, and there was the highest incidence of death by tuberculosis in Europe throughout the 1940s. So there was a backcloth narrative of extreme need. Taking the early correspondence around St. Bridget's, these reports from Miss Keane to the benefactors, Mr. and Mrs. Simmons, in October 1941, she writes that they had a cup of tea organised for the mothers, the new mothers of the creche, And it was the first time that one mother had had tea outside of her tenement dwelling in 8 years. In the same letter, we hear that children are becoming plump. By March 1942, with 28 toddlers installed, a dietitian visitor from West Africa commented, quote, "I have never examined better nourished children," unquote. A 1946 report highlights the precarious nature of Dublin's housing and Dublin's tenements. Quote, "One little girl, O'Brien, had sore foot all week, taken to Temple Street Hospital on Friday, septic report. Mrs. Kane's other child was killed by falling over banister in tenement house, and she was keeping the second child at home for the present," unquote. Another striking issue, and kind of my final point, is the ambition and far-reaching aspiration, really outward-looking, of the Ladies' Committee, which wasn't surprising given how highly educated most of these women were. For instance, at St. Bridget's, the doctor was Dr. Angela Russell, who was the wife of Dublin City Medical Officer, but unable to practice as she was married. She would give of her services, for her medical services, for free or voluntarily. And for instance, when social policy was shifting in post-war Britain, that legislation was circulated amongst the Ladies' Committee. They invited speakers over from Britain to lecture, provide workshops. And it would seem that as soon as barriers to travel were lifted, so this is just something I found in Mrs. Hope's, in Maureen's archive much later from the 60s, when barriers to travel were lifted following the war, members of the Civics Institute were off. Avis Mead travelled with her husband in 1954 to Mexico City and ditched him to visit nurseries. Similarly, she went to Sweden and she made extensive notes about equipment, especially around bedding and kitchens. In the same way, when it came to finally redesigning St. Bridget's Nursery, after years of attempts to replace the tennis pavilion, Maureen Hope turned to Scandinavian practices, very, unsurprisingly. So I found a series of pretty relentless letters to different nurseries and nursery supply equipment in Denmark and Sweden. And she was clearly abreast of American and post-war play experiments and adventure playgrounds, for instance. The final result was a prefabricated single-storey block given by Dublin Corporation in 1967. These are the buildings of my youth, I would say, prefabricated temporary blocks that are still there. And so my children have my youngest is 4 and she just finished here a few weeks ago, this building, temporary building. And inside, and see this image taken a couple of weeks ago, Maureen Hope did her magic, whereby she brought an amazing array of colour. She shifted scale and, brought as much light in as possible and changed floor plan in as much as she could. So this study of an unassuming building in Dublin's north inner city and its sister nursery in Maryland, Dublin 8, reveals various layers of Irish urban social history from the period, as well as signposting the presence, however latent that may be, of international architectural modernism in the Irish Free State. These examples force us to consider how such international modernist practices collide with the indigenous strain of Catholicism and its growing hold on social teaching, attempting to keep married women at home at all costs. It's about local level latent activism, which, by focusing on the child and by extension the mother and the family, most commonly but not exclusively in the slum context, seeks to influence urban Irish society as a whole. Thank you.
It's amazing what a sort of travelling tour we're taking this morning with so many new companions. It's a real privilege to be here. Get my right screen. I'm reading from my laptop, so that's why I'm sort of slightly... The preoccupation, conflation and contradictions between the image and identity of individual architects, the profession as a body on the one hand, and the realities of architectural practice and work on the other, frame the context for the Voices of Experience project, which I'm going to talk about today. 30 years ago, Andrew Saint explored this, setting out some tropes where these were most at odds. The architect as hero and genius, as medieval, as professional in the 19th century UK, as businessman in the 19th century US, as gentleman, as Bauhausian, as entrepreneur. In the relatively small literature field of historical work, which has taken professional and other architectural practice as its subject, and there's many people contributing to that in this room, this book exposes the divisions between the bewitching powers of art and the facts of everyday practice that cry out against it, traced back by Saint to Ruskinian origins. The preoccupation has generally been echoed and reinforced in the discipline of architectural history and its historiographic practices. As Saint has pointed out, the pursuit of and attention to sound building and the inevitable collaborative processes that are entailed are rare in architectural historical accounts or in architects' own articulations and presentations of their endeavours. Francesca Hughes' gathering of essays and cases of extended ways of thinking and doing architectural practice was significantly published at a time in the 1990s of collective re-looking at other, alternative, desired practices, driven by how architectural practice might be reconstructed from a feminist, or at least a regendered perspective. And Peggy Deemer's recent work, of course, begins to face this contradiction between art and reality, between desire and reality, and between the material embodiment of architectural work and the immaterial, personal, and social labour that is actually the real work of contemporary and the historic architect. Related recent scholarship is developing from a humanities perspective, and there's some wonderful work around industries of architecture by Katie Lloyd-Thomas, work from KTH Stockholm academics around architecture and feminisms, and we've got a forthcoming publication around behind the scenes, women in design history in architecture and culture. So in the Voices of Experience project, we follow these foundational threads and actively explore alternative practices of histories, documentation and dissemination, which might open and clarify the complexity and ecologies of what architects look like and what architects do. And we aim to foreground this by focusing on conversation, social and personal, over the individually authored biography with assumed powers, attributes and aims, and also significantly documentation in situ, where different aspects and several projects of sound building may have overlapped in time. Where are the existing historical sources for architecture in Scotland? They're pretty limited. David Walker's Ambition Dictionary of Scottish Architecture project is the most in-depth and consolidated public database. It advertises its scope as being the period 1660 to 1980, but the most detailed information covers the 140 years between 1840 and 1980, when mostly professional records provide the primary source material. Out of thousands and thousands of entries, I don't know the full final number, 194 are women. And of these, only 7 heads or faces of women are visible, who I briefly introduce now. Starting with the earliest face, or head, Edith Mary Wardlaw Burnett. And the entry suggests that she was possibly an architect professional. She was always in relation, daughter, granddaughter, niece, tutee, wife, assistant lecturer, assistant in the offices of. And some histories clearly need untangling. She's an unusual entry in this dictionary because she's always also present in some other domains. She has a profile entry in the womeninarchitecture.com database. And the most publicly visible work recorded seems to be Glasgow's Merkett Cross, 1930, with possible involvement in the urban building behind. Other work was domestic, in Scotland's Stirlingshire, where there's some signed drawings, a real rarity, as we've noted before. Number 2, Kathleen Veitch, perhaps a gentlewoman architect. And facts here tend to the conditional, with gaps and discrepancies in the documentation, and quite a lot of anecdotal evidence that, of course, you find is contradictory. And many of these entries are based on RIBA nomination papers, and of course all the proposers are always men at this point. And one of Kathleen's Fiona works, 1930s Little Salt Hall, also appears in local Scottish Borders accounts and Historic Environment archives as it was listed as a building in 2008. Margaret Brodie was also working in the 1930s, and she was pursuing the optimism of the modern movement. She's been acknowledged as the architect for the site layout of Glasgow's 1938 Empire exhibition and some of its buildings, which include the Women of the Empire exhibition, which has been published and talked about. Another Margaret Love, was admitted to the RIBA in 1938. Margaret Makins in 1941, and just a line, but she was chief architect for the island of Mauritius for 6 years in the 1960s. That's Margaret Makins again. Margaret Beveridge, and like many of the women, 194 in this dictionary, only seems to be recorded because she was a student member of the RIBA. There's no further work or discussion about what she might have done since. And finally, Anne Duff, who we will return to later. So Anne was assistant principal of architect of Abron Hill development plan for the Cumbernauld New Town Development Corporation from 1966 and 68. And she was responsible for designing some of the housing community facilities and also lived in the new housing for a while. And of course, the dictionary, I'm not trying to sort of openly deconstruct it, but there are obviously lots of things outside this which we don't know, such as Jean Peyton Reid, who doesn't appear to be registered. So existing and dominant practices of history, documentation and dissemination are evidenced in this example of the Dictionary of Scottish Architects as alphabetical dictionary, authored emphasis on biography, the historian and historical interpretation, artifact, professional record, institution, reading and searching by architect or building, so assumes a pre-knowledge and correlative textual, archival or published evidence. The practice of history is usually, as we know, a project of sifting, selecting, ordering, prioritising, and distilling for narrative communication to our present. But it's clear that when we are looking for women who are making modern Scotland, in our case, that the characteristics of historical practice, as shared by much of the work in this conference shared so far, are the other way round. They need to be inventive searching, they need to expose, they need to explicitly accumulate. We're not dealing with a surplus, quite clearly. And being open to architecture's expanded field and definition as making in its immaterial and material sense, of course means working at the edges of, outside and beyond the institutional domains which steward the formal knowledge and archives sustaining the canon. A chronological ordering of these 194 women does show the increased numbers of women studying or living in Scotland entering the architectural profession. I'm just going to run through these very quickly. A large proportion did not seem to progress beyond architectural study as they were student members, particularly from the 1950s and 60s. The ones in red, Margaret Richards and Kirstine Borland, I'll come back to because they're part of our project, as well as Anne Duff. And these entries become very patchy, although I'm delighted that Ewen and Fiona are in here. Which is wonderful. But I argue that this shows how reliant this criteria is on the normalised, famous and already recognised figures. The invisibility of women, or the not famous in architectural work, includes many omissions, and including participants in our project. And while the dictionary privileges textual sources over the visual, there are some extraordinary image-based comments not very far below the objective veneer of the database. And there is acknowledgement for this, and I think the authors of the database are quite aware of this and they want it to be improved and thickened. But it's quite extraordinary to read comments like this when we encounter what we think are good records. So the second part, I suppose we move into the project. 25 years ago, I started working as an architectural assistant in Glasgow, just after Glasgow's post-industrial reframing as City of Culture in 1990, and around the time that Elspeth King published The Hidden History of Glasgow's Women. And I found the book extraordinarily compelling and fascinating, but at that point I hadn't grasped how it had emerged from an impetus from a number of people and organisations and relationships to rebalance the macho, urban and civic histories that had been constructed around the Year of Culture. Women in Profile actively aimed to ensure representation of women's culture and formed the foundations of the Glasgow Women's Library, led by the visionary and energetic Adele Patrick and Sue John. And Adele Patrick was interestingly part of a feminist housing group Take Root, working in the late 1990s, around the time of another Glasgow makeover, the Year of Architecture and Design, on self-build housing in Glasgow's Gallowgate, and huge protest and contestation. Glasgow Women's Library moved into purpose-designed premises, the men's reading room in Bridgeton, designed by Collective Architecture, more on them later, only a few years ago. And Glasgow Women's Library, where Jude Barber, who's here as well, Director of Collective Architecture, is also on the board, has been a fantastically supportive site for the evolving public architecture and conversation events that we held in 2016 and 17. And I have to say, at this point, Jude and Nicola McLachlan, who's sitting next to her, it's been a fantastic ongoing collaboration project which we're sort of moving forward with. The other key impetus for the timing of this project was the backward-looking and parochial representation of architecture in the 2016 RAS Festival of Architecture year. And the state of the profession has been sorrowfully commented on by Cathy Slessor in a recent Urban Realm short essay. During the Festival of Architecture programme, the image of the architect was presented in the National Portrait Gallery through a series of architects' profiles. The exhibition displayed portraits of those who'd already had their image steadfastly fixed in society, the architects who'd found places in public galleries and on wealthy private walls. A poster created during the 1999 City of Culture showed a male tribe of similar headshots entitled Architects of Glasgow. A whole generation of educated architects later, nothing has changed. So the impetus was not isolated, and it was shared, I should go back, sorry, it was shared with the Archifringe Collective, who launched an exciting new open platform in 2016. This is the more positive side of practice and life moving forward. And what we love about the new platform is its inclusiveness of multiple viewpoints, emerging practices, experimental projects, reflective and collective stances. As an evolving open source web platform, it opens a place to see, to meet, and to make architectural culture in new ways. So Voices of Experience is a collaborative project. We're in the middle of constructing a website which has got a different domain name, Voices Architecture rather than Voice of Experience. We can share that when it's live. We've constructed a series of conversations between a highly experienced architect or maker of the built environment and an architect or other professional at the outset of their career. And it's deliberately the start of an ongoing audio archive intended to be housed in the Glasgow Women's Library. Each conversation has a project or thematic concern in common, often crossing significant time spans of engagement, and the participants discuss their work on location in situ. The contextual focus is late 20th century Scotland, and obviously for us this is a significant period of national history when the country itself is rethinking its national and political identity. Contributors to the project have included architect Margaret Richards, Nicola, you can see here, conservation architect Dorothy Bell, with Emma Fairhurst, also from Collective Architecture, Anne Duff, who I introduced earlier in conversation with Cathy Houston, who's been working on a community master plan in Cumbernauld with Collective Architecture, Mary Laverty in conversation with conservation architect writer Fiona Sinclair. And these are some of the events we had in the Glasgow Women's Library. And Kirstine Borland, planner and architect, in conversation with a young planner, Heather Claridge, who's working at the moment for Glasgow City Council. Denise Bennett is probably the most well-known person we've had conversations with, speaking to Grace Mark, who has worked in a number of school and more activist-led projects. Jocelyn Cunliffe, who's for many years worked as a conservation architect in urban Edinburgh, in conversation with Melanie Hay, working also in conservation between the west of Scotland and London. Histories are hidden, always in relation, personal and social, and there are many gaps that we need to reread in new ways. Now I'm aware, we're very much in the middle of a project at this moment, and we're working through the methodological, pragmatic practices and parameters, and looking for how we might take and frame the project forward. But we're really driven by the idea of making an audio archive that's resilient, that has an almost ethnographic, thick description quality to it, that transcription, listening will be part of what we contribute as an accumulative archive to be housed at Glasgow Women's Library. Architecture is the most public of arts. It's entangled with conceptual and literal constructions of society and environment. Excuse me. It determines how we shape neighbourhoods, yet expresses the hopes and dreams of the communities we dwell in and move through. But how do we see, hear, and talk about architecture in public life? Beyond encounters in everyday life, architectural projects and the people who make them are usually exposed through professional and educational channels. They reach public audiences through grand design media stories only when they become controversial, or of course, through the persistent perpetuation of the cult of individuation, the figure, the head, the face of the person representing the face of the building, the profession, or the project. Insights from the recordings we've made so far have been really broad-ranging and generous, very much personal and social. They include how architects discover their preoccupations, their strengths, their range and their niche through different working relationships and formats. Amazingly resonant experiences of women entering into architectural education decades apart, and the making and remaking of homes and work at different stages of life and outlook. So we've shared some of these excerpts at the Architecture in Conversation events at Glasgow Women's Library, where the paired conversations have offered us opportunity to listen to others' conversations and become much part of a larger, more public conversation around tea and cake. Voices embody the different ages, voices in the spoken voice, with mine slightly creaking at the moment, embody the different ages, backgrounds, bodies, and geographical journeys of these participants, and the conversations engender a wonderful sense of listening in, where the personal is mixed with quite significant insights. In themselves, the conversations have become accumulative. So from some outline structuring questions, which we all maybe start out with: how did you start? What inspired you? Who inspired you? What is your dream project? What's your advice to young architects? The conversations really move forward into amazing hours of fascinating reflection. And working in situ offers a contingency, a set of prompts and encounters to deepen and evidence some of the things that would be talked about in the abstract or in a more of a recollective mode. And the audiences at the project events have responded really positively to the social history aspects of the conversations. They've also openly shared their own insights, stating the favourite aspects of projects to be the modesty of these great architects, the variety of issues raised that show bold insights and achievements, and an insight into all aspects of architecture. So we're really excited because we feel that this project demonstrates a public appetite to understand what architects do rather than what actually some selectively choose to show. Making good architecture is a complex endeavour that's potentially significant with our collective life. Architectural knowledge is practice-based and experiential. We therefore need to pay attention to the real sophistication of the production of our built environment, the teams, the interrelationships, and the roles of expert and skillful practice negotiation positioned deeply within it. We need to extend beyond the narrow bounds of professional architectural culture. The authority of formally designated critics, designers, and historians of architecture, validated by their media, professional or educational institutional status, tend to hold a monopoly on who can speak for and about architecture. Our aim in the project is to enrich and augment the historical lenses and the many practice of documentation and dissemination through which we encounter all the many women who have made and are making modern Scotland. Thank you.
Well, thank you for two very rich presentations, which I think spoke so well to one another. And I think that idea of historical research as activism as well is something that you both brought up, and the importance of history to impact on the present was something that really spoke to me very powerfully through these two presentations. So I'm sure there's lots of questions for you as well. So I'm going to just open it up and ask if anyone wants to ask our two speakers particular questions. The lady in the red here. There's a microphone coming through to you.
You didn't mention Blanco White.
She's in the list,
she's
Kate.
in the list.
And sorry, I should speak into here. And she's also in the exhibition here.
Oh, is she?
We're not claiming at all to be definitive. I
Right,
suppose what
right.
I'm doing is really showing
Yeah.
the patchy reality
Yeah.
and how we're beginning to navigate it. I think there's a lot more work to do, and I think we're discovering so much in the way. I mean, I should say, can I interject here? Because Kate, who's sitting there, we're going to have a conversation with on Saturday. So we're really delighted with Eileen, who's going to be in conversation.
Yeah.
So anyway,
When I did my year out at Rumjam in Edinburgh, Blanco White was particularly mentioned to me as a really tough operator.
yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things, I mean, I'm over-critiquing possibly the dictionary, but it is one of these, a project that attempted to be systematic, attempts to offer a domain. And what's very interesting is it doesn't take very far to think what are the selection criteria? People who've studied in Scotland, who've made buildings in Scotland, who've had an influence, what does that really mean? I mean, that's actually a very complicated question. And most of what I've heard of the last day and a half have shown the complexity of how people move between different domains and influence in different ways.
Well, it is interesting as well thinking about a digital resource as not only just, and you talked about an open source platform as a way of capturing and disseminating such history, and obviously that has great practical effects, but kind of philosophically as well, to think about this kind of an idea of an open-ended history. That I think again you are both. There's so much work to be done. That the idea that one person can do this. These are often very collaborative efforts that need to go beyond a publication date and need to be revised, re-revised, added to. And I guess that question comes into histories of Irish architecture as well, which again you were sort of suggesting that this is a kind of an idea of a history under threat still, and so much work to be done.
Actually, our version of the Dictionary of Scottish Architects, the Dictionary of Irish Architects it goes up to 1940, and as such, women, so we have these imperiled buildings, which are gender neutral. They're just they're just offensive regardless who makes them, but according to the state, etc. But we're looking to start this Women in Irish Architecture, or Women and Architecture in Ireland, because I want to acknowledge some writers and conservation practitioners and whatnot, activists, but we would start with the Dictionary of Irish Architects, and it to date has been generated by mentions in the Irish Builder or membership of the RIAI, and it would seem that the first female member of the RIAI isn't until 1944. So and it's established in 1839. So over 100 years later, and Strahan. So it's a really acute. I don't know if it's to do with the post-colonial condition, or you're so obsessed with what your national can be, because you're getting freedom. It's not even 100 years since Ireland's independence. Such an obsession with this Volksgeist, and that we're just so behind in even considering gender issues. It's really extreme.
Question there.
Hi. I was struck by the fact that in both cases you're talking about creating an alternative place to record and explore women's architecture. And it strikes me that what we really would like is for women architects to be included in the mainstream narrative. I think that ending up with a situation where women are only acknowledged as being on the margins is very unsatisfactory, even though perhaps this is the only way that we make some progress towards it. But have you got any strategies for how we might change those mainstream records of architectural achievement to recognise women's architecture more adequately?
Well, I'm finding more and more, I'm thinking that the place of the record is usually so institutional, so private or difficult to access that actually how does it enter the public domain? And, it's far away quite clearly from most consciousness as per, Harry's introduction about the RIB, gold medal sort of persona. What's been really interesting in our project, and I think, working with Jude and Nicola from, a successful practice, working outside academia, working in a context which is the Women's Library, which is in between. In a way, that is helping to structure what we do and how we do it, because at each turn, and it's not particularly been by design, it's been as we go along, but we're actually communicating about what we're doing and that's drawing in public comment. And this social history aspect has been really super interesting, that people are absolutely transfixed by the social history of the place. Obviously, the Glasgow's Women's Library, it's extraordinary. It's a sort of locus, and I suppose it comes back to someone mentioned earlier about, you mentioned the micro history. And for me, it's something about this holding the kind of scale of history and acknowledging and valuing the most micro, which may be one conversation over 2 hours in some unit, and how that then you can access that. So you're not getting a kind of a big institution or record that you have to access in some way.
And it is interesting to think about the role of oral histories within that project, because often you do get the hesitations and the ums and the ers as someone's telling you their narrative, their story, which again allows for that. Allows for the kind of the non-linear, the moments of failure of a more complicated, messy history, which is not this, I will tell you my story from this date to this date, but allows for some of those, the hesitations, I think, to come through, which again, some perhaps written histories don't always capture or don't adequately capture. So I think that kind of oral, the different modes of history and historical research is a really, again, important thing that I think both the presentations brought up.
I should say in response to your question that this isn't an issue of making another platform. The female history, the history of women in architecture in Ireland is simply not there at all. So it's not like I'm looking to propose an alternative platform. It's to start to put it into the Dictionary of Irish Architects. So if you Google that now, dia.ie, you won't find a woman. Yeah, I think Eleanor Butler's mentioned she was a senator, but this is an extreme, this is a crisis situation that has come up recently in Irish drama. I don't know if you heard about Waking the Feminists, where there's very little, there's loads of Irish women playwrights, but none of them are getting gigs in the National Theatre. And so then we've also got the repeal of the 8th, which is to do with reproduction rights. So it's like feminism in Ireland is about to, or activism around gender issues is about to explode, I suppose, right now. So architecture is one aspect of that. And I should say also that when I talked about the marriage bar, there was an exemption for teachers, because so many teachers were female that the state had to lift that for teachers, or there would have been blooming nobody to teach the kids. So it is really extreme. So when I'm listening to what Suzanne has done, it's in awe. It's
a team. But...
Yeah, of course, it's a team. But in terms of what's going on with the Scottish setting of the record straight, or widening the record, we're still at the stage of setting one record, so as to stop demolition. So we're so not nuanced in this. It's a crisis situation, I would say.
There's a question here.
Hi there. I wondered if Ellen could tell us a bit more about the Tenement Museum that you're involved with, and particularly when it's planning to open.
Yeah. Well, good question. I wouldn't mind knowing that myself. Actually, I was over talking about in the Institute of Historical Research, do you know the Centre for the Studies of Home, Queen Mary and Geoffrey? So I was talking on Wednesday night, I gave a lecture on it. Probably should have advertised it outside, but to connection to this, because actually in terms of women's history and hidden history, it's fascinating. So the Tenement Museum, I'm project curator. It's to open, it was to open kind of last week. It's to open officially in January, but soft launch December. And we have just signed off on our literary immersive experience, which is a beautiful poetry by Paul Mellon and other Irish writers. So I would say the start of December, if you're in Dublin, you will get in. And I actually have an office there, so I can be emailed and I can sneak you in.
Perhaps we should all meet again.
One or two of you, not everyone. But yeah, the Tenement Museum is a really interesting way of, actually speaking of oral history, it's been run as a community project, so there's no collection. The collection is memory and story, and the walls of the building, so the walls can talk. So basically, it's this very intense life of a 1740s building, and we've got lots of stories, essentially.
There's a question. Paul, one of our other panellists.
I have two points. One, I've been doing a lot of database research on looking at women designers, for example. One of the things that I noticed, and we're seeing a lot of digitization projects of archives, like Cooper Hewitt, for example, spent $10 million digitizing 250,000 images in 2 years, but you can't search by women. So you can search everything like the name, the maker, the biggest item in the object in the collection, or the smallest, but you can't search by gender. And so that in turn can't tell you how many women designers or architects are in a collection. And I saw that you were using the architecture dictionary. Was there an actual
The two searches are architect and building.
Right.
I mean, it's very broad. It's at the early stages. I mean, it would admit it's at the early stages of a project, but so there's no nuance.
Right.
So you absolutely need to know a name of an architect and a particular
Right.
identified building.
Right.
So that's been built.
Right.
So that's really limited. That's
Yeah,
very
and I'm
narrow.
seeing that that's something that I think, if you want to know how many women are in a collection, women designers are in a collection, or how few, it does start to open up your eyes once you see the numbers.
No, that's me scrolling.
Yeah.
That's me going through.
So the second thing is when I spoke to Florence Knoll, and she said in the 40s, architects, if you were a woman, you fell into doing interiors because that's what women did. And yet, to this day, she still calls herself an architect. And I'm wondering if you're going to use the strict definition of what architecture is, because I think by its very nature, it is limiting to what a whole generation of women architects who ended up doing interiors and not being considered architects. I think it really is important to really have a wide definition.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's huge amounts of, the constituents of the conversations we've had show the breadth of what we're dealing with. We've got planners, we would like to have landscape architects, we've got people who are working not within necessarily the defined identity of an architect. The Dictionary of Scottish Architects is prominent with the term architect because it's professionally, most of the source material is from the profession. And that's something, obviously, we're just looking at that and noticing it. But I think the conversations we've had have been extraordinary. I mean, we've had the privilege of listening to them. We will be sharing them to get them out through the website and through the Glasgow Women's Library. But what's extraordinary is, I suppose there's an issue that came up yesterday about your presentation of self. In a conversation, just through the build-up of concerns and preoccupations, we found that individuals show the nuance of a niche in being an architect, and it may be about spatial planning, it may be about concern for sort of a social drive or conservation, and this shows sort of a kind of a massive range of that term. And the quote I had from Flora, which is it a useful term anymore? Of course, I agree with that. I don't think it necessarily is, but it's where we are working from.
There's another question here.
Oh, Suzanne, thank you. Both presentations were really great. I'm particularly interested in your project because it's quite close to something we've been doing at Parlour as well, with public storytelling and these public conversations. And I'm really interested in the motivation of the audience who listen in to this conversation, which is both public and intimate, and I've been thinking about the role of the audience as witness, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts about what the emotional investment is.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to have more, lots of work that we know is fantastic going on, we need to learn from, and there is something about that intimacy in the public. The Glasgow Women's Library setting, it deliberately sets up a space for an inclusive space. So it's round tables, there's not actually this kind of formal arrangement, even though there may be some microphones and technology. And that's been very inclusive. So they have a list through their work over the years, which has built an audience. The Archifringe platform we were advertised through, which had a more general architecture and a sort of younger audience. So we're finding it's quite broad, we've not analysed it. There's been about 50, 60 people at each of the events we did in the Women's Library. Yeah, about 60-ish. So, and I suppose the scale of that means that there's conversations with people around a table, there's conversations and we were actually playing back some of the recordings so that we could listen together, and the conversants hadn't heard back the recordings, so we were sort of introducing quite intimate aspects, and I think it's something we'd like to think more about and have discussions with Parlour and about, because there's something about the intimacy and the listening in which gives the integrity, I think, to what's being said. But you have to respect that. It has to be sort of respect what might be private, what might be public.
And also maybe that it feels spontaneous and natural and authentic, and there's a kind of authenticity that maybe really engages people.
Well, a great thing about a conference is to make these encounters and these conversations happen. And I am conscious that time marches on and we need to leave time for lunch to fuel those conversations, because otherwise we'll all feel a little weak after all these kind of incredible ideas. But hopefully we'll use the breaks and receptions to ask any questions that you didn't have a chance to ask, and to make conversation and friendships and encounters that have been stimulated by this event. There's a bit of a housekeeping. Lunch is going to be served here in the barrel vault, which is apparently upstairs. Okay. And then after lunch, there is a choice of where to go. And there's a session here at the AA, the Open Jury, and there's another session at the Paul Mellon Centre as well. So it's up to you. You choose which one you go to, and they start at 2:00. So, but I just want to ask you to thank our panellists for this idea of really drilling down through very careful case studies and research, the idea of hidden histories and thinking about the strategies and the politics of the kinds of work that we do through our research. So thank you to you all, our five panellists.